All right, a reading from Proverbs 25, one of my favorite sections in Solomon's writings. And you may know where I'm going. Proverbs 25, verse 2. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, to hide a matter, but the glory of kings is to search them out. It's a great passage. The glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search them out. Today, you have an outline with you. We're going to conclude our 6 essays. And again, I urge you to go back through them if you would like. They are, in many ways, very much an embodiment of what we have believed here at Providence for a very, very long time. And today, I want to conclude our discussion, our several essays. You remember Pastor Schneider's talk last week in different categories. I would suppose, Pastor Schneider, this would probably fall under the Litz side of the aisle here. Those who are more interested in liturgical theology tend to be more interested in symbolic theology. Why would that be the case? It's all the same. Why is there a connection between symbolic theology and liturgical theology? Think about all, yes, ma'am, sorry. Liturgy is symbol. Yes, everything that happens in the liturgy is a symbol. We have a table, we have bread, we have wine, we have some candles here. We have a pulpit. We have paraments, stoles. Brian? Aha, very good. Another one of our senses, the way we tie in the worlds together through taste and touch and other sensations as well, and hearing, and all these things. You know, for a very long time, I have drunk very deeply of James B. Jordan's works, and Jim is just the gift that keeps on giving. I was with him, I had a chance to see him in Texas a few months ago and spent a day with him there just to go by and see old Jim Jordan, who was such a faithful servant for many, many years, and after a few strokes, he is in many ways incapable of manifesting, expressing himself as he used to. He attended our congregation, for those of you who are new, for 3 years. Right when I came here, imagine being examined by James B. Jordan. He sat right there in that second row. And what was unique about him, Mickey was his pastor for much longer, is Jim didn't make much eye contact, so he kept his head down the whole time. And I always felt that was a sign of disapproval of everything I was saying. But that's just the way he was, just the way he is still, a fascinating individual. I have surrounded myself with a group of very sharp thinkers over the last 20 years who were always discussing things pertaining to biblical theology, biblical typology, biblical symbols, and we are all very much reminded of just how refreshing it is to read and reread Jim and learn and just listen and gain from his material over the years. If you're new to this conversation and you wonder who in the world is James B. Jordan, if you go to YouTube and just type Canon Calls interview with Uriesou Brito, you'll find an interview on where I spent about an hour talking about the life and the theology of JBJ, and I've done a ton of work on biblical symbolism and especially on my podcast as well. But today what I want to do is just offer just a little bit of a synopsis perhaps of the masterpiece of Jim's. And do you guys remember what that is? What book is that? Through New Eyes. Everybody knows the title of that book, Through New Eyes, Developing a Biblical Worldview of the World. And I'm going to give a summary of his theology of symbolism and mingling with some of my own thoughts that I've developed the last 2 decades on this issue here. You probably are aware, if you've been in the Reformed theology for any length of time, that there's a significant discussion going on today about the nature of worldview thinking. Worldview thinking. And worldview thinking simply says there is a way of looking at the world that is distinct. And if you have a Christian worldview thinking, there's a distinct way of looking at the world Christianly. That's what a worldview is, a view of the world, a Christian view of the world. But a lot of people today are reacting negatively to the concept of worldview. It's been a little bit of a response to the prevalence of worldview thinking in a lot of theological arguments. And the argument against worldview is that worldview thinking fixates itself on intellectualism, on a lot of big ideas, a lot of abstract ideas, a lot of ideas that we can't get a hold of. They're just so far away in the academic towers that we can't see, we can't hear, we can't touch. And what their response is that what that kind of thinking does is it undermines our understanding of how love and affection and desires shape our identity. In other words, for the responders of worldview thinking tends to be much more of data consumption than forming the whole man. Is that clear? A lot more, you consume data, and then you spit out that data when the unbelievers ask you, what is the hope that is in you? Well, you have consumed so much that data, you've absorbed it, and now you just throw it out. Here's the facts. Here's, page 7, article 3DX. And so that's the kind of thing. And whereas the response, the way we ought to think about it, is through the concept of formation. That worldview actually forms us into a specific kind of human being. The critique of worldview is a critique that I would agree with, that worldview thinking sometimes leads to a form of intellectualization that is unhelpful. And there's nothing wrong with the intellect and pursuing the study of the mind. God says that we are to love Him with our mind, strength, and everything else. So our mind is present there. But the overemphasis on the data consumption, on the details, on encyclopedic knowledge, leads worldview thinking to be rather abstract and unhelpful. And what people like myself, what we're talking about, what we're writing about, what we're lecturing about these days, that worldview thinking ought to certainly have elements of the intellect, but also we ought to incorporate into that desires, affections, and love. In other words, we want a tangible Christian expression. And so it's important that we understand that worldview shapes our formation, not only in a kind of discursive or analytical, philosophical way, but also worldview is going to form us. And I think the best way to form our worldview, as you can imagine, is through the biblical language. The Bible contains its own language that shapes us and helps our humanity and how we flourish, how we grow, how we blossom as human beings. The language that we're talking about here, Jim Jordan says, is pictured in ritual and architecture, in numerical structures and geographical directions, in symbols and types, in trees and stars. And if you're asking or wondering what has been, and I know you guys think about this every night, Pastor Brito, what has been your burden for the last 20 years? My burden has been to inculcate in the life of the parish a healthy love and affection for the Old Testament scriptures. That's my desire, to inculcate a love and affection for the Old Testament scriptures. Remember how big the Old Testament is. Can you see from there? It's this side here. This is the New Testament here. And the New Testament, this little section here, can you see Ron Smith? You can see all right? This little section here of the New Testament has a host of quotations from this big section here. But what evangelical interpretation has done is we have attempted to understand the New Testament divorced from this large section here. All these 39 books. That's what we have done. And what that has created is all sorts of difficulties in understanding, and it has created a kind of speculative theology that has made the New Testament complicated, overly complicated. This is the kind of stuff you hear quite a bit when people come to Christ. I've said this before. One of the first fascinations they have is, I want to interpret the book of Revelation. Well, good luck. There's a great problem with that because if you're a new Christian, the last book you should read is Revelation. Among many reasons that should be your last book is that the book of Revelation contains over 800 allusions to the Old Testament. So what does that require of you? It requires an enormous familiarity with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. It requires an enormous familiarity with the Torah, with the way Moses wrote the Old Testament. Without knowledge, Jim Jordan used to say that if he had his way, he would only let people read the first 5 books of the Old Testament for like the first 20 years of their lives, and then move on after that because it's so central to understanding how we are to see the New Testament scriptures. And then when we look at the Old Testament, the reason we give up so easily in the Old Testament is because we are divorced from that Hebraic language of the Old Testament, which means that we don't think very carefully about geographical direction. When I wrote my commentary on Ruth, there's a section in Ruth at the end where there is a reference to the east wind. Remember that? And you think about the east wind, west wind, south wind, north wind. They're all winds to me. It makes no sense. But in the Bible, there are distinct purposes for why God uses the east wind, and then distinct purposes for using the west wind. And the premise has been, for me over the years, is the Holy Spirit does not waste his breath, which means that every particular detail of the Scriptures, every iota is significant for us to understand these things. And what the modern evangelical interpretive mode has done is it's forgotten the significant language of ritual and architecture, of numerical structures. There are numbers everywhere, of geographical directions, of symbols and types, and we overlook ideas of trees and stars. And so what I'm arguing for is a worldview thinking that's rooted in biblical terminology, so that when we ask questions about animals and stars and sun and moon, our first reaction to these details is typically to put on our scientific caps on, or biology, and we think, okay, stars, far, far, far away. And then we think about animals, okay, creatures that roam the earth. And what we don't realize when we think in these categories is that actually we are thinking in a way about these categories that is different than the way Moses thought about these categories when he wrote them or when he inscripturated them into the text. We can say, if we look at a star, we can say, okay, here is a luminous spheroid of plasma held together by self-gravity. Yay! Thanks be to God. That's a great way of looking at that, but that is a distinctly non-biblical way of contemplating these things. And it's fine to have a scientific grasp of these things, but what I'm saying is it's not the fundamental way in which we look at the Bible. But a biblical worldview needs to prioritize the biblical definition of these things. And that's the complicated things, is that we are always attempting to bring a foreign hermeneutic into the way we interpret this text here. So if you go into the market and just type hermeneutics in your Amazon account, you will see 150 books in hermeneutics, 17 rules for how to interpret the Bible, 26 methods of biblical interpretation hermeneutics. And all these are interesting. I'm sure they add some validity to the interpretive model, but what I'm arguing for, what Jim has argued for, what Peter Lighthart has argued for, what we have done at our work in Theopolis over the years, is that the Bible itself provides its own interpretive model. That the Bible itself interprets itself. The Scriptures interprets itself. When you think of sun, moon, and stars, and clouds, how does the Bible think of these things? That's the question you should ask. That's the question you should ask. Not what Neil deGrasse Tyson said yesterday at some show. What does the Bible say? The biblical worldview speaks of these not only as a scientific reference, the Bible is historical, make no doubt, but as symbols of a hierarchy, of a system of structures that God has created within the Bible itself, within the world He has made. That's what I said before. Everything goes back to Genesis. Everything goes back to Genesis. And the use of these objective realities, sun, moon, stars, clouds, are not just there to decorate the Bible in the first couple of chapters. They're not just there to say, oh, look how cute these things are. These are not hallmark realities. But they're going to be used actually to describe every aspect of human relationships. So think about this. If you knew your Genesis 1 and 2, it would help you understand everything else throughout the Scriptures. Remember, the Bible begins with a tree. Revelation 22 ends with a tree. The Bible begins with water, the 4 rivers flowing downward from Mount Eden. And the Bible ends with a river of life in Revelation 22. The way the Bible begins is the way the Bible ends. And the way the Bible begins shapes the way the Bible is unfolded before you there. It's leading to a specific place. You want the sun to be warmth for you. You want the sun to warm you in the Scriptures. But you don't want the sun, S-U-N, the sun of righteousness to be against you, the psalmist says. You want the sun of righteousness to be for you. You want that warmth to be for you, not against you. And think about the concept of clouds, right? Something that a lot of evangelicals have never even stopped to think once about. What is the role of clouds? Think about this here. I'm pretty wired up this morning, Rusty. It's been a long week traveling. Here I am. Think about this. Look at a systematic theology book, right? All of you have systematic theology books, right, Ron? You got a few of those? Oh, okay, through New Eyes. You have your systematic theology book there. It's right there on the floor, holding the door so it doesn't hit anybody. And it's sit there in 1,200 pages. Oh, lovely, 1,200 pages. And you read through all the 55 chapters that are in your systematic theology book, and then you see prolegomena, and then you see doctrine of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, inerrancy of Scriptures, and then you begin to go through all the categories, 55 categories. Have you ever opened a systematic theology and saw chapter 5, a theology of human hair, a theology of clouds, a theology of trees? To my knowledge, Mickey, I think only R.J. Rushdoony has done something like that in his systematic theology. Modern systematic theologies don't talk about the things the Bible talks about for the most part. Hair is all over the Bible. Think about that. It's in the leprosy laws. It's in Samson's hair. It's in John the Forerunner's hair. It's all over the Scriptures. And we talk very little about these things. But think about clouds. Isaiah 19 says, "The burden against Egypt, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. And the idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst." Let's just do a little exercise here. Behold, the Lord rides in a swift cloud to Egypt. What is he accomplishing in his riding? What is he doing? Why do you think that language is there? Anybody? He's coming in a swift cloud. What is he doing? Is he coming to sing Kumbaya with the Egyptians? What's he doing? He's judging, exactly. He is judging the Egyptian. Clouds are used as God's judgment vehicles in the Bible. That's what they are. They come to form storms, to bring storms. And here God is using the imagery to describe the way he brings judgment to Egypt. And you see this in Judges 5. "So let all your enemies perish, and let the righteous shine like the sun." Shine like the sun. Why? Because the sun rules the day. May the righteous rule the day like the sun. Think about stars. We go on and on about this. We see in the Epiphany Glory, a star sort of pauses in the middle of the heavenly domain to demonstrate and to geographically point to the birth of Jesus, to the presence of the child. And the Bible is going to reuse the language that you see in Genesis 1 and 2. He's going to reuse that language throughout the prophets, throughout the Gospels. And in Matthew 24, it's just a prime example. You got Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, and then the book of Revelation. We call those the four Olivet discourses. And in Matthew 24, all you have in Matthew 24 is imagery from Genesis. That's all you got. You got language of sun, moon, and stars. You got language of darkness. You got language of voidness. You got language of judgment. You got language of building, of architecture, of structure. It's all there in Matthew 24. And remember, this is the language that God uses to infer judgment is coming upon a people, whether it be Egyptians, the Babylonians, or the Jewish people in the first century. God is using these distinct mechanisms of interpretation, sun, moon, and stars, to convey all sorts of things. Sometimes stars represent civil authorities. Kings are referred to as stars. Governmental entities, hierarchical structures on earth and heaven, God's judgment. Sometimes these symbols represent blessings. So there's much more than first meets the eye. Much more than first meets the eye. And of course, to grasp all this language, we need to see the language of the Old Testament. And not only do we need to go through our annual Bible reading plan, but we need to develop a certain level of appetite for visual images and repeated patterns. Appetite for repeated patterns and visual images. I've said over the years, one of the categories that I've used to talk to young folks is that there are usually two kinds of people. There are the poetic and then the practitioner, right? Some people say, I don't like this poetic stuff. I don't want to read it in John Donne. Just tell me what to do, Pastor Brito. Then other people want me to elaborate. No, please elaborate on that point. Can you give me a bigger picture of what you're trying to convey to me in this counseling session? Well, we need a little bit of both, right? The practitioner needs to humble themselves and learn from the poet, and the poet needs to humble himself and learn from the practitioner. Because if you lack these two categories, you're going to be very disoriented in the way you live your Christian life. You're going to be disoriented. And so here, we need to develop an appetite for the poetic structures of the Bible as a way of guiding us to understand what we call the praxeological element, which is the applicational element, the how shall we then live category. So I want to give you these two categories of of symbolism in the Bible, and I want you to just grab a hold of those here. I think they'll help you think through carefully through this here. The first is visual imagery. Visual imagery. Visual imagery is what we think about when we think about symbolism. Visual imagery. You can see these things, and you see that they are symbols. Jesus says, I am the door. He's giving us a visual imagery. Olive trees in the Bible, they symbolize the house of Israel and peace. Rainbow represents God's judgment or God's promise of no future floods. The ram, you see this in the book of Genesis, symbolizes the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ, who provides salvation. Water, we could spend a whole day talking about water in the Bible. It's all over. I would never talk about the theology of infant baptism without talking about theology of water first. Water, right? It represents our dependence on Jesus Christ. He's the fountain of all life. Gold represents purity. Calvin says that it represents the fruit of our labors. Iron represents strength and stubbornness. Iron sharpens iron. Strength and sharpens strength. Stubbornness sharpens stubbornness. That's visual imagery. You with me so far? Those are visual imageries. Those are symbols. But what about when those symbols repeat themselves again and again and again? What about when these things form a pattern and you say, wait a minute, I saw this in Genesis 1. I'm seeing it again in Daniel's dream. And now I'm seeing it again in the book of Revelation. When you see these patterns showing up and up again, patterns, themes, when they're repeated throughout the scriptures, we call those things typology. They're repeated patterns, repeated symbols. They're typologies. And in the Bible, there are three special symbols that God has given us, typological, that is, symbols that are going to appear again and again and again and again. You know, one of the problems is that one of the reasons man does not understand what his role ought to be in the new covenant, does not understand how he is to be, what kind of individual he ought to represent before God, is because we don't understand what man's calling was in the old covenant. What was the role of the priest? What was the role of a king? What was the role of a prophet? And if we don't understand that threefold role, it's going to be very hard for us to understand how Jesus fulfills all these three roles of prophet, priest, and king, or priest, king, and prophet. And as a result, we're going to have a difficult time imitating the God-man, because Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophet, priest, king motif of the Old Testament. And if we don't understand, what was the role of the priest? What does Exodus 28:29 say? What does Leviticus 9 say about the role of the priest? Why does he have garments? Buy my book. Why does he have these things? These are all a fulfillment of the language of the Old Testament. And so the repetition of these things refer to typology. Three symbols that show up again and again and again. You're going to see it every single sermon I preach here until I die. That is man himself, who is the image of God, the clearest, right? Man shows up everywhere. Word and sacraments. Man, word, and sacraments. And if you look at the trajectory of history, you're going to see that Satan has attempted to pervert all these three major symbols. Because if Satan can pervert the nature of symbolism, he can pervert the way we look at the world. Right? He perverted all three symbols. Remember this. He twisted the truth during his interaction with Eve. He undermined God's word. He downplayed the significance of sacramental symbols. If you eat of this tree, no big deal. Remember, the tree was a sacrament. It was for life. He perverted all three of these symbols, and that led humanity into sin, corrupted the divine image in man, and since then, we're not reading the Bible through new eyes. We're reading them through corrupted eyes, and we need more and more of the Spirit of God, the wisdom of the church to help us understand these things. We need grace. We need grace to restore these symbols and to reestablish their purpose. And that's why we do this every Sunday, boys and girls, every single Sunday. Because if we don't do this every single Sunday, we're going to have a distorted understanding of God's symbols in our lives and in the Bible. We're going to think, those symbols must not be important. They must not be a part of our daily existence. But it is a part of the biblical existence, and in Him we move and live and have our being. Therefore, there should be a part of our existence as well. The Word is reinstated through the Bible. It is reinstated how? Because there are two or three witnesses, and we have those two witnesses. The Old Testament scriptures, witness one, and the New Testament scriptures, witness two. And they're reflected, by the way, in the liturgical tradition. That's why we have a reading of the Old Testament, a reading of the epistles, or the book of Acts, depending on the season of the church, and a reading of the Gospels. We have all three, and what's missing? Fourth one that we recite. The Psalms, exactly. Old Testament, epistles, Gospel, and Psalms. We do all four of those. There's a lot of Bible in this thing here. Don't take it for granted. There's a lot of Bible. I had been in churches where the Bible was quoted once, maybe in a verse form, maybe a paraphrase of that one verse form. And here we read approximately, 80 to 100 verses every Sunday here, because we believe that the Word of God ought to be reestablished as a fundamental symbol. And then the sacraments, holy baptism and communion, they are nonverbal witnesses to divine truth. Right? Redeemed individuals represent a restored humanity. And so together, when you take the symbol of man, word, and sacraments, we form a biblical worldview. A biblical worldview. And we are restoring the way the Bible wants us to understand it. Any thoughts or questions there? Any observations? Pastor Snyder? Yeah, Pastor Snyder's talking about Steve Schlissel, who just died. He had a horrible accident in New York City. Faithful minister, died. He horrified people by making connections between the Old and New Testaments. And the reason he horrified them was because there's such an ignorance of the Hebraic scriptures. There's a trivialization of it, and I think the reality that he knew his Old Testament so well was it's just a shocking thing for many of us. Yeah. Horrified by that. And that's really the issue here is we have fragmentized the Holy Scriptures. We see 66 distinct books. But technically, biblically, there's no page that says, and now we transition to New Testament Scriptures. What you see is just an unfolding of the Scriptures themselves in the new era, in a new stage of redemptive history. It's not a complete New Testament per se. We might say Greg Bonson said a newer testament, which is an interesting way of phrasing that. Okay, what are the three symbols again? Man, word, and sacraments. Very good. Jordan summarizes, our purpose is to get into the Bible and become as familiar as possible with the Bible's own worldview, language, and thought forms. That world of the Bible is going to seem very archaic. We don't live in an agrarian society, but the Bible speaks very agrarianly. If you think about the reality of the Old Testament is dry. The Old Testament is, in many ways, rainless. When the promise of rain comes in the Old Testament, everybody's like, whoa, this is magnificent. The Old Testament is almost always lived in a desert reality, right? There's wilderness wanderings, there's desert realities. There's very little water in the Old Testament, very little water. You have a few exceptions, with the example of Jonah and a couple of others, but overwhelmingly it's dry. The dry place, that's why when a wind comes, an east wind, it comes and it brings judgment, and the west wind brings blessings. You want the right wind to come to you. You want to be refreshed by the wind because it's so dry. In the New Testament, everything now is being addressed to distinct cities. What's unique about the cities that Paul addresses in the New Testament? They're all seaports. They're all next to water. And Jesus tells us, I'm calling you so that you can be desert men. No, that's not what he says. What does he say? To be fishers of men. The New Testament transitions from a desert reality to a water reality. And water is the language of abundance, abundant life. So there's that transition taking place. The world of the Bible seems archaic at times, but it's a very intentional language. Very intentional language. What you see in the Bible is language building on language, glory building on glory, garden building on garden. You have a garden in Eden, you have a garden of Gethsemane, and you have a new garden in the new creation. It's garden, 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 mountain, mountain, mountain. Think of the great events of history, the mountain of Eden, the Mount of Transfiguration. All these things are mountain scenes because they're building on the language of mountain in the Old Testament. They're building on it. They're not reinventing anything. And that's what I want to communicate to you. The New Testament is not doing anything ex nihilo. It's not doing anything out of nothing. It's building on the language that's already been given to them. And you see this when John addresses Revelation. He's so familiar with it that he throws metaphors, he throws analogies here, he throws symbols here, and it's second nature to him. And for a lot of us, we don't have that second nature when it comes to the Old Testament because we've been New Testamentized. I just made that up. We have been New Testamentized. We have only seen significance in the life of Jesus, in the red letter edition. And we miss so much of what Jesus is conveying because Jesus is not divorcing himself from the law and the prophets and history. Jesus is in the same line. In fact, we'll see today in Revelation 3 that he's been given the key of David. He's continuing in the tradition of David. He's continuing in that tradition. So we need new eyes to see these worlds being built upon the other. So in summary, the Bible has its own internal interpretive model. If we believe that the most important worldview begins with the Scriptures, we will realize that we need to first and foremost rest in the language and imagery of the Bible. And what are we going to do at that point? If we see that, we're going to be looking at books of the Bible with new eyes. Think about the nature of the book of Jonah, for example, that Jesus uses again to speak of his own death and resurrection later, right? You have all these things. Think about the book of Ruth, which portrays this unique marriage between this Moabite woman, Ruth, and Boaz. And the relationship between the two of them produced a child named Obed. Obed means a servant of the king. He's going to be and from that line will come the line of Jesus. Isaiah says, this is in Isaiah 53, you have the servant text in Isaiah 53. And so what you're going to see in each book of the Bible, especially the smaller stories like Ruth and Jonah and Nahum, you're going to see microcosms of the larger picture of Scriptures. That's why we titled the commentary, The Gospel According to Ruth. Because in Ruth, you're going to see gospel themes in 4 little chapters that you're going to see expanded throughout the Scriptures. And so Ruth or Jonah or Nahum are little microcosms. They're little synopses of what you're going to see throughout the Bible. What are you going to see throughout the Bible? You're going to see marriage everywhere. You're going to see symbols everywhere. You're going to see a lot of gleaning taking place. You're going to see a lot of wheat and chaff taking place, things you see in Ruth. In Ruth 2:4, remember when Boaz comes out, he looks at the workers and he says, "The Lord be with you." That's the language that we use here at Providence from Ruth 2:4 and other places as well. There's greetings of peace. There's promises of redemption. There's a promise in the end of Ruth chapter 4 that in 10 generations, we will see the line of David come to fulfillment. Why 10 generations? Because it takes 10 generations for somebody to be actualized into this new citizenship of Israel, to be once again available to receive a royal lineage. All these things you'll find in a small book like Ruth. They're microcosms of what you're going to see throughout. And if you begin to see these things as imageries, as visual symbols, and then the repetition of these things, oh, there it is again. That's the typology that I'm talking about. And you're going to see this all throughout the Holy Scriptures. You're going to see it in the book of Revelation, shows up quite a bit. The usage of serpents, the usage of dragons, the usage of water monsters, what you see in Job. And so these are the repeated patterns that I urge you to be more aware of as you pursue your biblical interpretive model. Any questions or thoughts? leavens the whole lump. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't need to answer that question anymore. You just gave a bunch of responses there. That was fabulous. You should consider an internship at Providence Church. Fantastic. And the other one, of course, is fire, right? The eyes of Jesus, Revelation 2, they are a flaming fire. So, which means that he sees everything. It's an interesting. Why is fire referred to his omnipresence, or why is fire a reference to his ability to see things that are hidden? Well, because the book of James talks about this, right? Fire spread. But the fire of God spreads everywhere. Some fires can be contained. The eyes of God cannot be contained. And then you have the language of a refiner's fire, right? Fire also purifies. So that kind of language, and I guess part of the point is that biblical symbols are multifaceted. They are multi-perspectival. And so they have different layers. They're multi-layered. Just when you think you have exhausted a symbol, John says, I gotcha. There's more to it. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Pastor Snyder. Yeah. Yeah, until you have, somebody had another question. Was it Caleb? Or did you? Go ahead. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. Yes. Yes, yes, fantastic. And that relationship between God's created order, it's not so much that God says, "Ooh, I'm going to add meaning into water itself." No, these things are created with meaning. One of the points that Jim makes in Through New Wise is that everything that God creates is a representation of God. Everything. And they are there to point us to God. Everything that's there, it points us to God. When God creates a tree, the book of Judges says God is like a tree. He's like a vineyard, Isaiah 5 says. When God creates water, Jesus referred to as a fountain of life. Fire, the same way. So it's not that God is injecting meaning into these things secondarily, it's that he creates them with meaning. Everything in the world, that's why the Bible spends so much time articulating the faith of children. Because children go around saying, wow, wow, wow. We go around saying, ugh, blah. And we need the faith of children, for unto such belong the kingdom of heaven, and for unto such also belongs really the way the world is meant to be. We're meant to be wowed by the world that God created, because everything points to God, and everything has meaning that is given by God.